Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Donna Martinez. Welcome to another edition of Shaftesbury Society. Well, perhaps the message from the election of 2021 was enough already. Amazing results from several different locations across the country, and also some interesting things right here in North Carolina. We're going to be talking about them all today. And we're going to be letting you know about something that just broke today. It is the 2022 Civitas Partisan Index. We'll tell you exactly what that means, where you can find it on the John Locke Foundation website. It's a really helpful resource to let you know about the competitive seats in the North Carolina General Assembly. It's just debuted today, the 2022 version, so we'll get to that as well. So what happened in Virginia? What about that parents' movement? What happened in Minneapolis, where voters said no to the whole defund the police movement? And interesting things going on that could have implications for 2022 right here in North Carolina. I've got a great lineup of all of my colleagues here at the John Locke Foundation and at Carolina Journal, and they are ready to go to talk about it all. Joining me is Andy Jackson. He is the director of the Civitas Center for Public Integrity here at the Locke Foundation. Donna King is editor-in-chief of Carolina Journal. Mitch Kokai, a senior political analyst here at Locke, and Terry Stoops, who is the director of the Center for Effective Education here at the Locke Foundation. So let's get right to it. Terry, boy, this parents' movement proved to be quite something. Tell us what your reaction is to what occurred on Tuesday.
Well, education matters, and I'm not just saying that as one of the education guys here at Locke, but as someone that looks closely at what happens at these election results, both here in North Carolina and elsewhere, is that parents had enough. And we could anticipate some of this with the latest Civitas poll. We asked parents to grade school boards on two issues. Politicized classrooms and masks and vaccination mandates. And overwhelmingly, parents gave low or failing grades to school boards based on their feeling about how they were dealing with both of those things. And, you know, if you look at those poll results and then you look at some of the outcomes, especially in Virginia, of parents voting really objecting to the way that school boards were resuming school for a lot of students that had been out for the last year or not really receiving the education that they feel like their children deserved. You see that there truly is a parent revolt occurring, especially with those individuals that may have voted for Joe Biden in the last presidential election or voted for Democrats in the last election, believing that Democrats, as they've traditionally been depicted, know better when it comes to public education. Well, I think parents understood that no, that doesn't seem to be the case, that the Democrats necessarily have the best interests of public school families at heart. That there was an interview with CNN with four public school parents, and they talked a little bit about what swayed them to vote for the Republican nominee for governor, Glenn Youngkin. And among the many things that they talked about were concerns about learning loss that weren't being addressed by their school boards, about the fact that Terry McAuliffe appeared with the head of the American Federation of Teachers, Randy Weingarten, on the last day of the election. I think parents understood that there were one set of candidates, mostly Republican candidates, that were listening to them on their major education issues. And there was another set of candidates, mostly Democratic candidates, that really weren't, that were taking their votes for granted. And parents spoke at the ballot box.
They really seem to feel cut out of the process. And I'm kind of wondering if part of that is because during the COVID lockdowns, when schools were closed down, parents had to be over the shoulder of their kids through Zoom, watching exactly what was going on and hearing what was going on in those classrooms. And it appears really that some parents were surprised by some of the things that they were hearing and seeing out of those classrooms. And then they were shocked that at least you have some elected officials, some school board members, some candidates for office who really don't think parents should be playing a role. And boy, did that play out. Donna, it was pretty amazing to see the parents speak in the state of Virginia.
It really was, and it did not surprise me at all, actually, because we're seeing that here in North Carolina and some places as well. What I think it really spoke to was school shutdowns and COVID moved these education issues from theoretical, hypothetical, or happening to someone else, and moved them straight to people's kitchen tables. Because in many cases, they may love their child's teacher, they may be involved in the PTA, but they're not in the classroom. And this put them actually in the classroom and brought the classroom to their homes. And that's something that a lot of parents either they were forced to confront something that they maybe realized was there, but hadn't thought too much about, or they thought it was in theory. I've heard a lot of people say, well, we don't teach critical race theory. My concern, because I have public school children as well, is not that they don't teach critical race theory. If they actually taught it and explained what it was, I would probably be okay with it. It's that everything is being taught through the lens of critical race theory. And I think that there's a problem with some of the school board members who either underestimate that parents get it and understand what's happening, or they're just tone deaf to some of the concerns that these parents had. And we saw that happen in Virginia.
And Terry, you mentioned the phrase learning loss, and there seem to be some educators who think, well, it's really not that big a deal. We'll do a little bit of summer school or we'll do some catch up and all that. But parents seem to be placing, at least based on those Virginia results and the comments we heard in the interview that you referred to on CNN, parents seem to be really, really concerned about learning loss. And we've heard some of that here in North Carolina as well.
Yeah, and they should be concerned about it. You look at test scores, they have plummeted, and there doesn't seem to be at this point a real strategic plan for going forward and addressing learning loss in a way that can assure parents that it's going to be thoroughly addressed. But, it's just a year or more ago that the North Carolina Association of Educators, the president, Tamika Walker-Kelly, called learning loss a false construct. And this denial of learning loss and the importance of not only measuring student performance, but addressing policy matters on the basis of student performance, I think is absolutely critical. I think most people get it, but I think they're seeing a increasingly out of touch teachers union, increasingly out of touch education officials, that are doing things to address learning loss that are politically beneficial for the short term, but really don't get at the need for addressing this in a long-term way, because the long-term economic consequences of learning loss are profound. If you look at what the projected loss of GDP, for example, gets into the hundreds of billions of dollars, because as students fall further and further behind in school, they enter the workforce with fewer skills, with less knowledge. And that means that there's going to be a drag on our economy if we don't address learning loss in an aggressive way. Now, I think that we have started doing that to a certain extent in North Carolina with summer programs, but I think we need to do a lot more. I think we need a state-funded tutoring voucher or education savings account and other ways to aggressively address learning loss. Otherwise, not only will the North Carolina's economy lag, but our nation's economy will lag. And that's something we cannot afford in this era of increasing international competition.
One of the most important things about what Terry just said, from my perspective, is the lack of a plan. I mean, I think Terry McAuliffe might have been in better shape in his election if he had had some sort of plan for dealing with learning loss and the other concerns that parents have. It doesn't have to be a great plan. We know the government comes up with a lot of ideas that might sound good, but don't end up turning out that well. But to not have a plan and to spend the last day of your campaign out there with the head of the National Teachers Union, a group that has done everything in its power to keep kids out of school and to ensure that teachers have to do as little as possible to help with the recovery from COVID-19. That sent a very terrible message, and parents saw it and reacted to it.
From a political point of view, traditionally, education has been seen as an issue where Democrats had an advantage. In polling in Virginia, actually, most voters said Republicans were better. And part of it is, as my colleagues talked about, is that parents were able to see behind the curtain. see what kind of things were being taught to their children and to not have their valid concerns addressed. And when people vote, basically you have one vote. I mean, you can vote for multiple candidates, but you can only vote one time, hopefully. And
That's
so
up to people like you to ensure that, Andy.
yes. And well, what you vote on is what's most salient to you. And for parents, your children's education is highly salient. That's what's going to be driving votes. As long as people have concern about how their children are being educated. So this is an issue that should be bipartisan. We should have both parties agreeing that learning loss is real and that it needs to be addressed. But at least politically so far, for whatever reason, it seems to be only members from one party that are emphasizing that fact. And until there is, say, more punishment at the ballot box, it may be a while before we can get both parties on board and address this in a bipartisan manner.
Well, it makes me wonder if the professional election industry working for Democrats isn't, as we speak, or already have put together some sort of a strategy document telling Democrats, gee, you are incredibly tone deaf to what clearly is a huge issue. And so 2022, Mitch, is that going to be driving North Carolina races, parents' concerns about what's happening in the classroom and what their kids are being taught?
It certainly has to be a factor. I mean, I think a candidate running for office in 2022 who doesn't take this issue into account is certainly putting himself or herself in a very bad position, because a lot of parents, a lot of voters in general are going to be looking at these races and saying, okay, who is going to help us recover from all of the education loss that we've seen because of COVID-19 and because of the shutdowns, mandates, all kinds of changes that were not foreseen. And as I said earlier, I'm not necessarily convinced that you need to have a great plan. It would be nice to have a great plan, but at least have some plan. We know that some of the plans are going to be better than others. The ideas that Terry mentioned would be among the best, the tutoring program, some sort of education savings account. But even some other plan that might not work as well, at least it shows that the politicians are thinking about issues that the voters care about.
And Terry,
one of the things.
Go ahead, Donna.
Oh, well, one of the things I wanted to bring up, you were mentioning how you would think that there was some strategic document perhaps in the works for people to address this on the campaign trail in 2022. I'm starting to see, just through our coverage, signs of that emerging. But what I'm really hearing is not that candidates should acknowledge and listen and seem less tone deaf about these issues. What I'm hearing the message be is that they're saying that parents are being duped by a post-Trump era alarmists about issues that don't really exist. That's the strategy I'm seeing emerging from some of these candidates when you look at the reviews and the post-game analysis coming out of the Virginia race. So I think their message is not going to be, let's sit down at the kitchen table and find out what's going on. Their message is, you're being duped, you're not smart enough to see what's really happening, and this is a post-Trump era alarmist.
Well, that's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out. Essentially tell the voter that has just spoken, you really don't know what you're talking about.
Right. I'm seeing that much more likely than some of these candidates going, well, maybe there is a problem, we need to talk to them.
And even worse, in some respects, basically the message is, if you are concerned about these issues, it just shows you're a racist. Right. And that was one of the responses among Virginia Democrats was, oh, Youngkin won because there are too many racists. That's not going to win you future elections when you tell a large chunk of the electorate, people who might be disposed to vote for you otherwise, that they're racists and they're just being duped.
Let me just say, too, that the issue for the Democrats is the union money. They rely on the teachers' unions for so much of their supports, their campaign support, and they're in many ways beholden to the teacher union message. And so the question is does the teacher union pivot on their message, and does anyone take that pivot seriously after they do it? Or does the teachers union play or try to play less of a role in the campaign, which I can't imagine doing, given the tremendous amount of money that they pour into elections, mostly for Democrats. And so the Democrat, I think, really has an issue here with how do you handle the unions who have been so adamant about keeping schools closed, so adamant about mask mandates, vaccine mandates, and in so many ways duplicitous about where they stand on some of the major issues with regard to learning loss, in-person learning, critical race theory. There's going to have to be some side, either the Democrats or the unions, that give in this situation. And I just don't know whether it's going to be a standoff or a détente.
Well, I can understand that there might be some Democrats or strategists who work with Democrats saying, oh, this was just a one-off in Virginia. But then it makes me wonder, how would they explain the New Jersey governor's race, that it does look like the Democrat has prevailed there, but it was oh so close in a very blue, dark blue state. So one would think that there would have to be a realization that it wasn't just a particular situation in Loudoun County, Virginia, that turned out more parents who were concerned than would be representative in other states.
Well, remember also, go ahead, Andy.
Okay, I was going to say that you also have to remember there's a kind of a larger backdrop to this. So Republicans did have, in general, a bit of a tailwind because the Biden administration is become less popular fairly quickly. And traditionally, the Virginia, New Jersey races, the president's party does a little bit worse. Now, that doesn't explain this kind of wholesale slaughter that happened in Virginia and this close to overturning a Democratic governor who is apparently still fairly popular in a pretty blue state. So that's those kind of tailwinds, that thermometer reading is not the whole issue. And going back to what we said earlier, it's clear what parents have seen with their own eyes and heard with their own ears about their children's education. That is a big part of what has happened in both those states. And just the idea that the politicians are not listening to them and not taking their concerns seriously. And that tends to raise the heat on people. If people don't think that the politicians they elected are listening to them, they are likely to go the other way.
I was going to jump in also and say that, Donna, you mentioned earlier that there could be some Democratic consultants who have put forward some sort of strategy sheet or something saying this is something we need to pay attention to. I'm sure that's happened. One of the problems that we've seen in the current Democratic Party, and you see it at times in the Republican Party as well, is a fissure between various groups. There is the Democratic Party group that's basically about getting power, winning elections, and doing what needs to be done to have that happen. That's going to be the pragmatic group that's going to say, look, let's look at these elections. Here's where we failed. Let's come up with a response that'll get us votes next time. But then there's also the true believer progressive left that says, look, here are our policies and our principles. And if people don't like it, it's their problem, not ours. And I think that's something the Democratic Party is going to have to wrestle with, that the group that has been far out of line with mainstream America has not been such a loud voice in the Democratic Party in years past that it caused people to turn off from Democrats. But I think now that group has had such a large voice in recent years that the pragmatic folks, the ones who just want to keep and gain and hold on to power, are having less of a voice when discussions are taking place about how to move forward with campaigns.
Well, we know that through the Civitas poll, the most recent one, that President Biden's job approval is way down. I think it was at 39%. I mention that because there's just poll after poll that shows dissatisfaction with the Biden administration and what the president is doing. And so I think that is the other backdrop to all of this inter-Democratic Party debate over the two groups, Mitch, that you're referencing, and where will the party go, and at what point are they going to say, hey, we still need to get elected, versus trying to just get everything we can right now and then lose control of everything. I want to point out to people that there is a new USA Today Suffolk University poll, and I blogged on this at the Locker Room, which is the John Locke Foundation's blog. And here are the findings in this. I mean, this is absolutely devastating to the president. They asked the question, do you approve or disapprove of the job Joe Biden's done as president? 37.8% approval. I'll say that again, 37.8% approval. The disapproval is 59%. And in addition, in this poll, nearly half, 46% of those surveyed said that Joe Biden has done a worse job as president than they expected, and that includes 16% of those who voted for him. So essentially about 1 in 6 of Biden voters say he's worse than they thought he would be. So a very, very bad political times for President Joe Biden. And we're talking about the public policy agenda of the Biden administration. And Joe Biden has tried to distance himself, even as a candidate, from the whole defund the police effort. But that voters had their say on that as well on Tuesday in Minneapolis, defeating that initiative to essentially turn the police department there into some sort of a social justice and public health department. And voters had none of it. And you would think if there was any city in which that was going to prevail, it would be Minneapolis, which was the place where George Floyd, where that killing took place. So is it the end of the progressive agenda, at least for now?
I would say it has faced a significant setback with this election. The progressive agenda is not going to go away. I mean, they believe what they believe, and they're going to continue to push for it. But certainly that agenda is knocking up against reality. And despite what we might think about government, its main true number one task is keeping people safe, either from foreign invasion, if it's the national government, or from people trying to break into your house and bop you on the head if it's local. And so when people start talking about doing away with police, it's just not something that's going to fly outside of probably the academic hallways and the left-wing rallies. I mean, people want to feel safe in their communities. And after having seen all of the violence that erupted after the George Floyd killing, I think a lot of people are thinking twice about this idea of defunding police. So short answer is, I don't think the progressive agenda goes away, but when it knocks up against reality and sees a failure like this one, cooler heads need to prevail and say, well, what can we do that tries to get at some of the problems that we've identified that might be legitimate, but not going to the crazy end of getting rid of police?
Yeah, and that's something we've seen elsewhere too. Seattle elected its first Republican district attorney since forever on a similar issue. The Democrats had, they have a different kind of primary system, but the Democratic nominee was somebody who was really radical, was willing and able to turn out violent protesters back out on the street and essentially let them go, no questions asked. And when you're facing that kind of reality check, voters are going to turn back and, put the brakes on things like that. And I think we're going to see that even in some of our more progressive towns in North Carolina, your Asheville's and your Durham's, they may tweak the edges, but I don't think there's really going to be any constituency that's going to say we're really going to be on a defund the police agenda, because it's in nobody's interest, certainly in nobody's political interest on the Democratic side, because they've seen the results of pushing that agenda. So reality is going to come in and save the day in just about every jurisdiction.
This is a good place to leap in and say that despite the fact that we saw such a message sent on the red side of the fence in Virginia, there are places where people with a left of center message have won, including the Paris of the Piedmont, Carrboro, North Carolina, elected a Democratic socialist as a mayor. This mayor, Damon Seals, got 90% of the vote running against a local businessman. So there are still some places where having a very left of center message can win, but I don't think that those places are beyond a place like a Carrboro, where it's a very large percentage of voters who are far left of center. I think in most parts of mainstream U.S. cities and communities, you have to have a message that's not quite that extreme.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of that, the Chapel Hill Carrboro City Schools elected three new school board members, Risa Jenkins, George Griffin, and Mike Sharp, that had a basically defund the school police message, in addition to various other far left initiatives to try to narrow their massive achievement gap that they have there in Chapel Hill Carrboro. So it's interesting that there and in Mooresville Graded School District, there were school board members elected that had very much a progressive mindset, a progressive platform, and won based on appealing to voters on those issues.
One of the interesting things I think it's important to point out is as we go into the 2022 elections, North Carolina's counties will be re-electing their sheriff. I believe all 100 counties will be really looking at the ballot for sheriff in 2022. And this will be an important conversation to have, because one of the things I think the left really tried to do through this movement is to disassociate a safe community from the presence of community policing. And we've talked, of course, John Locke Foundation put out good information, good research on that as well. And reestablishing that connection for a younger generation is important because what they see is, things like what happened in Minneapolis, and reestablishing the connection between a strong community police department, a strong leader in the sheriff's office, and having a safe community that's growing and flourishing.
And Donna, I'm glad you mentioned that. I want to just remind our viewers that what Donna referred to, the John Locke Foundation research on the issue of policing and crime, and what the research shows about the best way to address that. That is the research by John Guzet, who is our senior fellow in legal studies here at the John Locke Foundation. He has a great piece out. You should read it. You can go to johnlocke.org and you can find it right there. And he recommends intensive community policing, hiring more police officers, paying them more, doing some retraining efforts. It's a really solid piece. It is the roadmap forward to address crime and make sure that communities in our state are really safe. And so I want to make sure that you know that that is there as a resource for you. Let's go ahead and turn to 2022 if we could. Andy, the big thing, of course, is that we are drawing new districts. And in fact, last week, the General Assembly passed those new maps for legislative districts. It was a very public and open process. Andy, give us a quick update on what's occurred. And then Mitch is going to give us a quick update on, I guess, was what we all expected was inevitable. There's already lawsuits against those districts. But Andy, tell us how this went.
Well, it opened up the General Assembly. The redistricting committees jointly set a group of criteria, using racial data, trying to keep communities of interest whole, trying to keep municipalities whole. There was a whole host of criteria that they voted on. Then they had a series of public hearings all across the state. They had 13 altogether, one for each of the then current congressional districts. Then came back, started drawing maps, and if you enjoy getting a good afternoon's sleep, you could have sat down and watched them as they were drawing the maps live on one of 4 computers in the rooms for the House and the Senate. Once they had kind of a slate, the Democrats had maps they thought were good. Republicans, especially particularly leadership in the committees, had some maps. Then they had another round of public hearings where people were discussing the map. Disproportionate amount of those came from organized interest, as you could imagine, putting the stamp what their groups thought would be good or bad about those maps. And then finally they had their actual vote last week. And the maps are generally, just like the last group of maps, tend to be a little more Republican leaning than Democratic leaning. We can get to that a little more in a moment. But as you've already said, then the lawsuits came out, actually even before they voted on the maps.
Yeah,
in fact,
Mitch, we expected lawsuits, but before they were even approved.
Yeah, that's right. I think we could have placed some bets on how long after the maps were passed would we see the first suit, but then everyone would have lost because there was the suit that took place before the maps were approved. That was a suit that basically challenged the process. The folks who filed that suit said, look, the General Assembly is going about this the wrong way. They should be incorporating race, because previous court rulings, and they basically remind us of court rulings from 20 years ago and not really the court rulings in the ensuing 20 years. But the court rulings have said that you've got to draw these Voting Rights Act districts first, and then you could go about with the rest of the process. But the General Assembly didn't do that. And so the process is flawed, and you should throw out the maps for that reason. Well, that case never hit a courtroom before there was a final vote on the maps. But then within a day of the maps being approved, plaintiffs associated with Eric Holder, the former Obama-era U.S. Attorney General, filed suit against the congressional map, saying it was a case of gerrymandering. And of course, because of the way that the courts have ruled in recent cases, including as recently as just a couple of years ago, a lot of the action on gerrymandering suits is going to be taking place in state courts. Federal court ruled in the Covington case, Covington versus North Carolina, a few years ago, that federal courts are not going to be dealing anymore with partisan gerrymandering, the idea that one party or the other goes too far to build an advantage for their party. You could still sue in federal court if you can make a case for racial gerrymandering, that you're somehow disenfranchising a minority group in drawing your districts. But if you're going to say that the districts are too partisan, that Republicans went too far in building an advantage, a suit like that has to go through the state courts. And that's basically what the plaintiffs are looking at. And Andy can chime in on this because I'm sure he's following it very closely and has some thoughts on it. But my guess is this is not the last of the suits. We'll probably see other groups come in, file suits, make slightly different arguments just to tie up these maps as much as possible before we can ever have another election with them.
Yes, it's going to be going in state court. Eric Holder's group is going to be involved. They actually had a kind of a subgroup of their subgroup operating in North Carolina called On the Line, where they were training people on how to give testimony, and in a sense, just to salt the public testimony so they could then in turn use that in the lawsuits. And the leader of that group said as much, that they wanted people testifying so that they could have that kind of evidence that they could present in the lawsuits. And Mark Elias hasn't sued North Carolina yet. He's a Democratic attorney. He represented Roy Cooper in 2016. I'm sure he'll find a reason to sue. And there's cause to be concerned, aside from any legal arguments, that we had a situation in North Carolina where we had, I'll pick on Mark Elias. He came in and sued North Carolina on procedural matters ahead of the 2020 election. He basically lost across the board in that lawsuit. But then in state court, he was able to enter into a settlement that a lot of people, including me, would say was a collusive settlement with the State Board of Elections and the North Carolina District Attorney to essentially win some of the things that he had lost in that earlier federal suit. And so that's something to look out for, is that who are the judges on these cases? How strongly is the Attorney General going to represent the case? Now, the leaders of the North Carolina House and Senate can intervene as defendants. They did in that case in 2020, but the judge ignored their intervention. So that is something, no matter how you feel about the merits on these redistricting lawsuits, that you do have to look out for. Is there going to be that kind of collusive agreement at the local level? Then what's going to happen on appeal? I would expect the defendants didn't appeal in 2019 in that round of lawsuits. We may see more appeals this time around, depending on how the verdict goes.
Andy, a couple things that I'd like you to clarify for our viewers, if you would. Number one, when you say collusive settlement, essentially the parties in a lawsuit actually agree. You know, normally we think of a lawsuit, that's two people or two groups that completely disagree on something, so they go to court and they want the law and a judge to duke it out for them and come to a decision. But in a collusive lawsuit, you mentioned Mark Elias, the two parties actually agree, and they're just trying to get a judge to put the seal of approval on what it is they want.
Yeah, and that's what we saw in 2020. The State Board of Elections Executive Director Karen Brinson Bell had pursued things like extending the deadline for absentee ballots, getting rid of the witness requirement, and a host of other things. And it just so happened that the Democrats led by Mark Elias, were suing on similar grounds. And so they essentially did not have a difference of opinion on that then. And the Attorney General's office was telling the bipartisan state board, actually it's a 3-2 Democratic state board, that there's no way you can win this suit. You're going to lose. It's going to be worse. You're going to lose everything. So you need to settle. When in fact, similar lawsuits had failed in other states, and including in North Carolina. So that set up that collusive settlement. And the point is that you have two folks essentially not disagreeing. So they're in agreement basically on what they want. And they have the settlement. And there's a third party, in this case, the elected representatives in the General Assembly. They're causing harm to a third party by not adequately defending the laws that were passed by the General Assembly, particularly election laws.
So we just want to remind our viewers as well of those two names that you've heard mentioned here, and the John Locke Foundation and Carolina Journal are following the roles that these two people and their groups are playing. One is Mark Elias, the other one is Eric Holder. So be sure that you follow what we're doing, the work that we're doing on that to make sure you understand actually the influence that these people are having when it comes to voting integrity, voting law, and lawsuits here in North Carolina. Andy, the other thing I wanted to ask you about is this issue of drawing maps and the issue of race and racial data. So we heard that there's a group that is suing over the maps, saying that you need to comply with the Voting Rights Act and consider race. I believe I have that right. But yet I thought you can't consider race because that's discriminatory. So how do you draw a map under those conditions?
Well, the basic rules under the Voting Rights Act is that you have to, when you have areas where you have a sufficiently large concentration of minority voters, you should have districts where they have a chance to represent, to elect people of their choice. So there's two components of that. It's got to be sufficiently large, and it's got to be in a compact area. Now, the approach of using data is you go out, you use the data, you find large concentrations, and then you draw maps around those areas. The problem is the Supreme Court told North Carolina in 2016 that you cannot use race as the predominant factor when you draw maps. So that leaves you the other approach, which is if you've got if folks are concentrated in in a concentrated area, if you just naturally draw compact districts that respect city lines, districts that respect communities of interest, you're going to draw maps that are going to incorporate areas with significant populations of minority voters. And so if you do that approach, you don't need data. You just need to have a clear system on how you're going to draw the maps. And that way you're drawing maps, you're going to have voting rights district compliant, Voting Rights Act compliant districts without making race the primary factor in drawing the districts. Because once you say, I'm going to draw this district, but for racial data, it would not look like the way I'm drawing it, then you're actually violating the Voting Rights Act, and you're going to get that district slapped down by the U.S. Supreme Court.
And one of the problems we've had, Donna, for a number of years is that the courts tend to keep changing the rules. I think when the General Assembly first started under Republicans to draw the maps in 2011, they had a couple of goals. They wanted to elect as many Republicans as they could, but within the law, they wanted to have the maps hold up to court scrutiny. And I think that they believed in 2011 that they did that. In fact, they got pre-clearance from the Obama era Justice Department for their maps. But since then, suits have been filed at multiple levels, federal court, state court, and the rules have continued to change. When can you use race? When can't you use race? How much do you use it? We even know that when it comes to having a district which is so-called majority minority, allowing a group of minority voters to elect the candidate of their choice. How do you determine how much is enough and how much is too much? I think Republicans tried to find a safe harbor by drawing districts in the past that had 50% plus one minority voting age population in a district, saying, look, 50% plus one, they've got to have enough people to elect the candidate of their choice. But then some courts have said, No, that's packing. That's packing minority voters into a district. As long as they had enough voters, meaning enough white Democrats along with them, that they could vote for a Democrat to be in office, although that's not the language that they use, just the candidate of their choice, that would be enough. So that if you had maybe 35 to 40% African-American voters in a district, that would be enough, as long as it gave African-Americans a chance to elect a candidate of their choice. The rules continue to change. I'm hoping that the rules won't change again, but I'm not holding my breath, because the courts have not been consistent about what is the proper way to go about drawing these districts.
Yeah, it's enough to make your hair hurt. Just it's kind of the moving target, and it seems that no matter how much effort is made, and there's been a substantial effort made to try to comply with the different rulings and do things transparently and in public, and yet lawsuits continue. Donna, that's one reason that you do have different groups of people, left, center, and right, calling for more of an independent redistricting commission rather than having the General Assembly draw these maps.
We are hearing a lot about that. I tend to feel personally that there is no such thing as an impartial or truly independent commission. It's been tried in other states and has not fared really well. I would be surprised if we saw that happen here. But I do think that what we've ended up with currently, what these maps say, is not significantly different. Wouldn't yield a significantly different result than what we've had, say, the last 10 years, the last decade or so. I think that, once you draw our maps, we may be a purple state across the board and average, but we really are, there is a very distinct blue area, very distinct red areas. And when you draw a map, that's what it looks like. That just is what we look like. And so it's not going to be significantly different. One of the tactics that groups are also taking is there's a group called the New North Carolina Project. It's a branch of Stacey Abrams' New Georgia Project down there, and their goal is to start getting more voters, particularly voters of color that they feel like have been disenfranchised over the last few years. But it really is another get out the vote effort, and that is how President Obama won in many cases, is just by creating new voters, getting them to the polls for the first time. We're seeing that effort really stepping up right here ahead of 2022.
Andy, these maps that we're talking about under legal challenge, but they are actually passed by the General Assembly. And this is one, and Donna, just verify this for me. Governor Cooper
Sure.
plays no role in this. He can't veto this like he does some other bills. So the maps are the maps, and they've been passed.
That's correct. Cooper would not sign off on them, which means that's why you see a lot of legal challenges from people who don't like them, because that's going to be the voice where it ends up.
So Andy, you and your team have created the 2022 Civitas Partisan Index. And folks, this has gone live just this morning here at johnlocke.org. So if you go to the website, you will find the ability to get to that partisan index right away. And you can actually see the different legislative districts. Andy, it's pretty fascinating. Tell us just briefly what it is that you are trying to do with this index, and how should people read it?
Well, the Civitas Partisan Index is basically a baseline measure of the partisan leanings of all the new districts. My colleague Jim Sterling and I, along with some help with some interns, crunched the data from the 10 Council of State races from 2020, and we put those in aggregate in all of our 2,700 precincts across the state. Then once we had the official bills, then we went in, looked at the bills, and assigned state House and state Senate districts for all of those precincts, and then essentially added up those precincts. And in some cases, portions of precincts, we had to divide those into small pieces with census blocks based on the legislation. And from that, we were able to assign a number, basically, how much variance is this district from what we would expect from a statewide race? So, for example, basically, North Carolina, to put a little bit of a change on what people say, is actually a 51-49 state. We tend to be, in most elections, about 51% Republican, 49% Democrat. And so how much does each of these districts, or how much do each of these districts vary from that? And that's our baseline measure. And we assign a number, either, plus or minus how much Democratic or Republican. And then we assign a partisan lean. For example, is this a safe Democratic seat? Is it likely? Is it lean Democratic? Is it a toss-up? And we have a few toss-ups as well. So it took a lot of work getting the data in. We got the data in, and now we're presenting it at johnlocke.org.
Yeah, it's a great resource, folks. And again, just to kind of summarize, you might have already heard of the Cook Political Report, like at the national level. This is patterned off of this. And so as Andy described, so for each state house and state senate district, you're going to be able to take a look and see that district's voting tendency against the whole of the state. So the result is going to be a letter, a D or an R, and then a number, and that's going to indicate to you whether that leans Democrat or leans Republican against the state as a whole. And Andy, what's really fascinating in the latest index for 2022 is that you find that we've got some very interesting competitive races, so it should be interesting.
It does. I mean, it basically kind of reflects the way the geographic patterns of the state are, as has already been discussed. Republicans start with a bit of an advantage. If they win, all they have to do is win kind of all the seats that tend in the Republican direction, including some that are competitive. If they do that, they get a majority. If they can pick up those toss-up seats, then they are right up there in a supermajority. Democrats have more of a challenge. In order to win a majority, they have to win all their leaning seats, all the toss-up seats, and pick up a handful of seats that lean Republican. Now, they were able to do that somewhat in 2018, which was less of a blue wave year than some people, 2018, which was less of a blue wave year than some people say it was. So with this map, it is possible for Democrats to win a majority. It would take a good year for Democrats, and it means they have to have good candidates in a lot of these, close swing districts. Likewise, Republicans, if they can run some good candidates, they have a chance to pick up those supermajorities, and we could get back to another round of fighting with Roy Cooper over all the bills that are going to get vetoed.
Donna, it's also important to note that when people talk about redistricting and their concerns about maps, they sometimes have very different views about where things should go. Some people would like to see a map that ends up producing a legislature or a congressional delegation that's about 50-50. Well, the only way you could really do that is to gerrymander toward that result. You would have to stack the maps so that you would end up with about a 50-50 split, with most of the seats being safe for one party or the other. Other people will say, well, no, I just want as many races to be competitive as possible. Well, I don't know that you could really do that in North Carolina, given the geographic limitations of the fact that there is this sort of people living closer to the people with whom they agree politically, meaning that there are a lot of Democrats very closely packed in the larger urban counties, and Republicans are more dispersed. But also, if you were able to draw a map that gave you competitive elections throughout the state, 120 House seats, 50 Senate seats, what you would end up with is that in a particular year that's good for Democrats, you'd have a ton of Democratic representatives and senators and not many Republicans. In a year that's good for Republicans, you would get the other way. So you wouldn't end up with 50-50. You could have competitive seats. You can gerrymander toward a closer to 50-50 result. You probably can't do the two at the same time. And it's generally better when looking at the concerns about gerrymandering just to follow some of the other important criteria that Andy has done such a good job of pointing out, like having the districts be compact and contiguous, and trying not to split cities and counties and other government units that people rely on. If you do those sorts of things, you'll end up with a map that allows people who live close to each other to be voting on the same people, rather than trying to gerrymander toward a particular result, whether it's a major Republican advantage, a Democratic advantage, or even a 50-50 split.
So Terry, when it comes to 2022, what about the issue of parents and education? I mean, we think of that as a local issue. After all, it's been local school boards where you've seen parents show up and question and disagree and want to know more and want to be involved. Yet we just saw in the state of Virginia a statewide race for governor where that was a big issue. Are you expecting it, for example, to be an issue in the U.S. Senate race in 2022 here in our state?
Absolutely. And from my point of view, a focus on parents is always good politics. It's good policy as well. And it just took Virginia to remind, I think, some elected officials and candidates of that fact. But we are going to hear individuals that are running for Congress talking about these issues. One just needs to be reminded of the fact that it was the National School Boards Association that gave a letter basically talking about parents being akin to domestic terrorists to the Department of Justice. And of course, the Department of Justice and Merrick Garland ran with the issue and decided to get his people and use taxpayer resources mobilized in response to this National School Board Association letter. Of course, we learned later that the Biden administration collaborated with the National School Board Association on that letter. And so here is a legitimate issue for individuals running for Congress to talk about. Is the federal government overreach in going after parents? I don't know if the Biden administration learned any lesson from this. I don't know if Merrick Garland is going to start pulling back on his effort to provide resources to local individuals because these parents are mad at school board meetings and they're saying things that some school board members don't like. Now, that's not to discount the fact that there are legitimate instances of parents crossing the line, of making threats to school board members, of doing things that would definitely violate law. And those issues are always best dealt with on the local level with local law enforcement. But we are going to start hearing more about not only empowering parents, but trying to pull back the federal government from becoming a barrier in between parents and their local school boards and parents and their ability to influence the development of public policy that is in the best interest of their children.
Donna, are you expecting that when it comes to those Senate primaries, both the Republican candidates and the Democratic candidates, that they're going to be asked those questions that Terry was just talking about as we head into this Senate primary?
Sure. I think that these are going to be top of the list questions, mainly because of what we saw in Virginia, but also because we're seeing school boards, wrestling with being suddenly in the public eye much more than they were before with parents. And one of the things that's something to be thinking about is this call to have education money follow the student. Republicans over the years have kind of owned that issue and owned the school choice issue, but now we're seeing more parents that perhaps hadn't heard the argument are being exposed to it. And they don't really realize that the money is not following their child, that it's going to the school. So you're pulling more people into that tent of school choice. And I think we're going to see a lot of that in 2022, particularly as parents try to find the resources for remedial work and helping their kids catch up on what they've missed. The parents who can afford to do it outside of the school system, hire extra tutors, go to summer camps that help them catch up. And those parents who can't suddenly are going to realize that, that their children need it too. And that extra help is going to have to come out of their pocket.
We have an interesting question on Facebook from Ken who asks, how might Donald Trump affect the Republican chances in 2022? Should we expect to see the former president coming into the state?
I thought it was interesting that Youngkin did not pull him in to the stump and did not have an appearance with him, but he was able to tap into the Trump voter and tap into some of those issues. So being able to thread the needle that way, I think was successful for him because the issues are very real. The voters pull a lot of weight in the ballot box. I think that I would be surprised if you saw him really start to stump with a lot of our candidates. There will be some that do, but I think that Virginia example of how Glenn Youngkin was able to thread the needle will be a lesson learned for a lot of candidates.
This has a direct implication in the Republican U.S. Senate primary. Now, once we get a candidate after the primary, it'll be interesting to see whether Donald Trump plays much of a role in the general election. But in the primary, that's basically been the main thing driving Congressman Ted Budd's campaign is, hey, you don't know who I am, but Donald Trump endorsed me. And so it's going to be hard for him going forward to not try to tie himself to Donald Trump, because that's basically the way that he has gotten attention. The other really big name in the race, of course, former Governor Pat McCrory. And so if Ted Budd, who has been making some gains in the polls, but is still behind Pat McCrory, without having Donald Trump in the state forum, it'll be interesting to see whether he could succeed. My guess is that Ted Budd needs to have, if not Donald Trump in the state, at least some sort of on the record appearances by Donald Trump, even if it's in a video somehow saying, hey, remember, I like Ted Budd, vote for him. Then after the primary, whoever wins, whether it's McCrory, Budd, or Congressman Mark Walker, former Congressman Mark Walker, whoever wins, then it will be interesting to see what sort of role does Donald Trump play between the primary and the general election. The Youngkin result would suggest that it might be good for him just to give an endorsement, but then otherwise be quiet and stay out of the state.
And interesting too about the current president, President Biden, if we look at the Terry McAuliffe Youngkin example, the current president didn't do Terry McAuliffe any favors by going to Virginia. So should the Democrats in the Democratic primary in this Senate race, should we expect to see Joe Biden, Kamala Harris here in North Carolina?
If I were the Democratic candidate, I wouldn't want to see him. Certainly. And we also saw, you mentioned President Biden getting into that race. It also didn't seem to help Terry McAuliffe that Barack Obama came in and talked and stumped for him. So it'll be interesting to see among the Democratic candidates, who do they get to come and campaign for them? I would say right now, given the current numbers, Joe Biden would be a non-starter.
Yeah, and it would make sense for them to tap state level elected officials. We've seen Mark Walker, for example, tying himself closely to Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson. We might see some presence with Governor Cooper and with other elected Democrats from other states play more of a role than those from Washington, D.C.
Terry, I'm glad you brought up Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, because that leads me to the candidate who won in Virginia that I wanted to make sure we talk about, and that is their Lieutenant Governor-elect, Winston Sears, who is a Republican, and she is the first Black woman to hold that seat, to be elected statewide as Lieutenant Governor in Virginia. And I'll tell you what, Donna, there's some interesting reaction from some of the cable news shows to that. Some of them not really wanting to talk about the fact that a Black woman was elected statewide in Virginia.
Well, it doesn't fit their mold of what they would expect from her. And I think she's a rock star. I mean, it's just interesting to hear her talk. She's got a fascinating story. She does have a lot of similarities in her positions and her background as our Lieutenant Governor, Mark Robinson. USA Today did a story on all what they touted as all the big wins for people of color. And they focused a lot on mayoral races, Boston, New York, some of those other places. And they left Winston Sears out. They didn't include her in that race. And that was probably the highest ranking person that won that night in that list. They got a lot of heat on Twitter, even from their fellow Democrat journalists who said you can't leave her out, and they added her in later. There was an updated version of their story that posted, including her. It's interesting. If you don't fit the mold, you don't fit the narrative that they had probably written before the election happened, she got left out. And I think that has emboldened her and her supporters to really get out there, make a difference, and make sure that they're heard.
And to the issue of Winston Sears' background and story, a very inspirational acceptance speech, a victory speech on election night. I actually put that in a blog. You can go to the John Locke Foundation's blog Locker Room and find it there. You can just search on my name for my blogs, and I posted it right there, posted the video. Watch that speech. She is a shining star for sure. And lastly today, I wanted to make sure that we hit this story where those of us who believe in freedom and liberty were very happy at the results of this one, and that is out of Buffalo, New York, where the socialist was defeated. It's just the strangest race. The Democrat write-in candidate was the current mayor who got defeated in the Democratic primary. But, you know, we are now seeing socialists who are proudly describing themselves that way, and they're getting on the ballot and they're getting votes. What do you make of that?
I think it's interesting. Go ahead.
I just was going to say, we mentioned earlier, a Carborough Democratic Socialist won the mayor's race with 90% of the vote running against a small businessman. So we're seeing that in our own state. It'll be interesting to see whether that type of political philosophy can extend beyond a community like that in North Carolina. Obviously, it got fairly close up there in Buffalo.
Pretty amazing. So it was quite an election night 2021, and I have really appreciated the conversation today with Andy Jackson, Donna King, Mitch Kokai, and Terry Stoops. Thanks, folks. Really appreciate you joining in today to help us take a look at all of these results. Now, just a reminder, folks, that if you are watching us on Facebook, then you are probably right there. You're going to see the links to a lot of the stories, the Carolina Journal stories that we've discussed, and also some of the research, for example, on intensive community policing. Links right there so that you can easily find the information that we've been talking about. And of course, check into carolinajournal.com once, twice, 3 times a day, because they have fresh content constantly being posted, and election and public policy is one of the key areas that Donna's team is reporting on. So make sure that you do that. Really appreciate you joining us today. And if you like what we're doing, if you like the information we're bringing to you, and if you like the fact that our researchers, that our outreach team, that they are out there really making sure that legislators and the public are informed about these key issues and key choices that we as North Carolinians make for our state, we would like to ask you to help fuel this work and continue the progress and the information that we're providing here at the Locke Foundation. You can do that very easily by making a tax-deductible donation to fuel our work. Just go to johnlocke.org. In the upper right-hand corner is that Donate tab. Just click on that. It's secure, it's fast, it's easy. In less than 2 minutes, you can make that tax-deductible donation. We would be most appreciative. So thank you to those of you who have already donated, and to those of you who may make a first-time donation today because of what you've seen here and the quality of the work and the team that are really working to help you here in North Carolina. Thank you so much. Hope everybody has a good week. Hope you will join us again next week for another edition of Shaftesbury Society. I'm Donna Martinez. Thank you so much. Have a good